knocking gold off the ground. To the point, informative, entertaining, and protecting the Second Amendment. Welcome back to Elfster's Rifles and Reloading. And I guess today would be Elfster's Pistols, Rifles, and Reloading. And I guess it's pistol reloading somewhat non-existent on my channel, but I do reload for it. And today I happen to be reloading 200 total rounds of 9mm, some really inexpensive berry bullets here in a 115 grain round nose using non-existent Winchester primers here. Small pistol primers, which are impossible to get right now across the board for all primers. And I'm using Unique. And I reload for not only 9mm, but I also reload for 40 Smith & Wesson and 45 ACP. And today I happen to be reloading 9mm using the Lee Deluxe Pistol Die Set for 9mm Luger. And I figured, you know what, I got this all set up. Why not have you guys join me on this adventure of reloading 9mm, at least showing you how I do it. I'm not showing you how you should do it. I'm showing you how I reload for pistol. So keep that in mind. And also, I don't want you to use any of this load data. That's where you need to do your homework. I'm only showing you how I reload. I'm definitely not showing you how you should reload. Now, with that said, I need to split this up into a two-part series. I'd like to do this in one part, and I definitely could do that, but the good old YT won't let me show you how to complete a finished cartridge from start to finish. So I'm going to split this up into two parts, so keep that in mind. Now, using these inexpensive copper plated, they're not copper jacketed, but copper plated berry bullets, I'm just coming up with some really inexpensive rounds here for blaster ammo, for slow-mo vids, for my videos. But you know, if you want something that is a little bit more accurate, a little bit more precise, you know, I will typically use these copper jacketed XTPs made by Hornady. And I've had pretty good luck with those in regards to accuracy. So keep that in mind when you're watching this video. So enough of the BS talk. I want to try and make this as clear and concise and right to the point as much as possible. Like I said, this is me reloading. I'm not showing you how to reload. Let's get this going. Now, this series example is on 9mm, but all this information, setting up your dies, blah, 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 is pretty much universal across the board. And these examples of 40 Smith & Wesson and 45 ACP, with a little bit of a caveat there, especially on the 45 ACP. You know, we're reloading for 9mm here that uses small pistol primers, and 45 ACP uses large pistol primers. With a note, they do make some 45 ACP, if you're new to the game, that has small pistol primers, and it can be very frustrating when you're trying to reload for 45 ACP, especially on a progressive press, and you're not sorting through all of that brass to weed out the small pistol primers. So keep that in mind when it comes to 45 ACP. I would say 1 and maybe 200 pieces of 45 ACP brass you pick off the ground is more times than not, it's going to have a large pistol primer, but you will get that one that will lock down your whole operation if it does have a small pistol primer. So keep that in mind. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, you're familiar with my reloading series on reloading for bottlenecked rifle cartridges, you'll know that one of the first steps that I recommend doing is popping out that primer, decapping that primer right out of the gate. But that's a whole different story when it comes to pistol cartridge reloading, straight walled cartridges. More times than not, especially on a progressive press, you're going to leave that primer pocket in, and you're going to pop it out as one of your very first steps, or one of the first stages of your progressive press. You're going to pop out that primer and you're going to resize it, and then it's going to move on to the next part of belling that out. So with that said, you need to make sure that those primer pockets are 100% dry, especially if you use something like a wet stainless steel tumbler for cleaning your brass. So you might want to, before reloading that brass, pop out maybe 2, 3, maybe even 4 pieces of brass, pop out those primers, and make sure 100% that those primer pockets are absolutely dry. Because if you don't, and those primer pockets are wet, and you seat that new primer, there's a good chance it's not going to work. Now, what I like to do, especially for ranged pick brass, is I'll have bags of very dirty, full of sand and dirt, grass, you name it, ranged pick brass that is waiting to be washed and dried. On the other hand, once I get through washing and drying that brass, I'll have 9mm brass or whatever, 45 ACP, 40 Smith & Wesson brass that's been cleaned and dried thoroughly right down to the bone. I know for a fact that those primer pockets are dry. Like I said, I'll even pop out a few, make sure 100% of those primer pockets are dry before they go in this bag. And it actually says clean brass ready for reloading on this bag. And this is ready to rock and roll. And I will put it in a Ziploc bag like this, and it helps with the tarnishing. And you know what? I really don't care about the tarnishing. Super shiny brass is not accurate brass. My main concern is just making sure it's clean, especially for my sizing dies. And that's really important. So keep that in mind. Make sure those primer pockets are absolutely dry. Now, a couple quick notes here before I show you how to turn this dirty range pick brass into clean, ready to rock and roll brass, is some guys like to use dry media, walnut, you name it, dry media in a tumbler for pistol brass. It just makes it easier for them to make sure that that primer pocket is 100% bone dry. But for me, I still like to use a wet stainless steel tumbler. Matter of fact, I don't even use stainless steel media anymore. And I know some of you guys know that, especially for bottleneck rifle cartridges. I stopped using stainless steel media altogether. As long as your solution is good with the very hottest water you can get out of your tap here, I'll let this run until I start to see steam coming off the water. A good squirt of Dawn. And when I see a squirt, it doesn't have to be a lot, something like this, and you're done. A little bit goes a long way, and make sure it is Dawn and Dawn only. There really is no substitute. And I will use a teaspoon of Lemmy Shine. And that solution, depending on how many pieces that you're cleaning, if it's 100 pieces, you know, it might only be an hour. If it's like 1,000 pieces, it might be more like 2 hours in a wet tumbler like this. It's just something you're going to have to learn in regards to if you're using a wet stainless steel tumbler or a tumbler with no stainless steel media, or if you're using a dry tumbler. That's just something you're going to have to figure out on your own adventure. But if I was to give you one solid tip here, especially when it comes to straight wall cartridges, something like 9mm 40 Smith & Wesson or 45 ACP, is to make sure you separate out that brass before you clean it, especially if you're using a wet stainless steel tumbler with pins. If you try to get all your range pick brass and it's mixed together with 9mm 40 Smith & Wesson, 45 ACP in a wet tumbler with pins, what will happen is those 9mm casings will get stuck and nest inside the 45 ACP brass with the pins, and to the point where you can't even pull them out with pliers. And it just turns into a mess. So take my advice, separate out the 9mm, the 40 Smith & Wesson, the 45 ACP, get them in their own separate, dirty, ready to clean bags, and then clean them. Now, there are 100 ways to skin that cat. Now, in my opinion, if you are using a wet tumbler, is to have a dehydrator. I mean, I've seen guys that will take it out of the wet tumbler and put that brass out in the sun to dry. I've seen them put it on cookie sheets and ovens. But my personal opinion is just get a dehydrator. It just makes it easier. And that reassures the fact that your primer pockets are 100% dry. All right, so let's turn this bag into this bag here that's ready to rock and roll for the reloading process. So I'm gonna get my tumbler here. I'm gonna get this water rolling here so I get the hottest water possible out of my tap. I actually made this special funnel here to make it easy to get the brass inside the tumbler. I actually have a video showing you how to do that. Let me grab my brass here and dump that in. Now this is the dirty range pick brass. It's full of sand, dirt, grass, you name it. Now here's the hottest water. It's almost to the point where I can hardly touch it. I see steam coming off the water. So I'm going to put a nice solid squirt of Dawn and Dawn only in here. Something about like that. You don't need a lot. A little bit goes a long ways. I'm going to get that teaspoon of Lemmy Shine. And you can notice I am not putting any stainless steel media in here at all. Just the solution. Get some good suds going on here. Spray this a little bit. Now fill this all the way up as much as possible. So I'll run this a little bit short so the suds don't overflow when I put this cap on. And for something like that, that's quite a bit of brass. I'm probably going to do this for about an hour and a half.
2 hours later.
And with no stainless steel media. And usually I'll rinse with cold water to keep down the tarnishing. Look how dirty that water is. So I'll fill this up with some cold water and run the brass just like this. And this is what's nice about not using any media whatsoever. You don't have to worry about separating it whatsoever. And what I will do after this is throw it in the dehydrator to make sure obviously that the brass is totally dry, but most importantly, the primer pockets. So I'll shake the brass like this for a little bit to get most of the water out of the casing. And just to show you how clean this is, perfect for reloading with no media whatsoever. Let me see if I can get a little bit closer picture here of how clean the inside of the casing is. And this isn't dry yet, obviously I just took it out of the water, but you can see it's more than acceptable for the reloading process. And the outside is as clean as can be. So that is a lot of pieces of brass. I would say damn near 1,000 pieces of brass. So I'm going to dump this on the first tray. That's probably about 200 pieces. I'm going to grab another tray here and dropping brass over the floor. Evenly disperse this around. Grab another tray. Dropping more pieces on the floor here. And grab one final tray. I still have one tray left. So that's where this Lyman Cyclone case dryer really comes into play. And check out the description box below. I'll have a link for the specific product. It is an affiliate link, so if you do click on that product and make that purchase, I do get a little bit of affiliate kickback, not too much, but it definitely helps out my channel in regards to the future progress of this content. So let's put this lid on here, and I'm going to set this for the full 3 hours. It's a lot of brass. It's a lot of drying time.
tomorrow for sure.
All right, so this brass ran its full 3 hours on the Cyclone case dryer here, and this brass looks amazing. And let me grab a few pieces here, and it appears to be dry. Let me point this down so I can show you some of this brass, but this brass looks amazing. And the inside of the case body here, let me see if I can zoom in here for you guys. Looks nice and clean, and this is with no stainless media whatsoever, and this is more than acceptable for reloading. And like I said before, it's all about if these primer pockets are 100% dry, and if they're not dry, I got to put this back in this Lyman Cyclone case dryer until these primer pockets are dry. So I'm going to grab some more pieces here on each tray just to double check.
So I'm gonna grab some out of this, I'm gonna grab some out of here, and some out of the bottom.
And some miscellaneous pieces of brass here out of each tray. And I'm gonna pop out the primer pockets just to make sure that those primer pockets are 100% dry. And this brass ran for the full 3 hours plus sat overnight. This is the next day, next morning. So
I'm just gonna pop out and size these pieces, and that doesn't hurt it absolutely whatsoever, obviously.
now I'm sure there's going to be skeptics out there that wet tumble, and they're going to say BS. No way, you just did that. And you guys just watch this. This is no BS. The inside of these case mouth openings are as clean as can be, especially where the bullet is being seated. These case mouth openings, at least the first, I would say, ½ inch of them, are as clean as can be, and that is with no media whatsoever. And the bottom of these pieces of brass are completely dry. And you'll notice there is a little bit of residue at the bottom of these cases because I'm not using stainless steel media. But I tell you what, when that powder ignites, it doesn't give two shits. It just doesn't, and it doesn't affect the performance or accuracy of your pistol ammunition. All I'm concerned about, yeah, there might be a little bit of residue at the bottom, but I'm not concerned about that. I'm more concerned, at least for about the first ½ inch of the case mouth opening where I'm seating that bullet, and these cases look amazing. And like I said, once you get to this point and you're 100% sure that your primer pockets are dry, you can do the following. So today I plan on reloading 100 total pieces of 9mm brass here, and I should be good to go here for future reloading purposes. I got an insane amount of brass here that's clean and ready to rock and roll. Now in this 9mm example, I am going to use unique at 5 total grains. You can see I put a mark on here of when I purchased this, and yes, it is that old, 7 years. And the reason why I do this is I like to use my old powder first and then use the newer powder after that. We got the berry bullets here, which are obviously 9mm, 0.356 diameter. They're round nose, 115 grain. Now keep in mind, these are copper plated. They're not copper jacketed for very inexpensive plinking. And obviously the non-existent primers here during these C19 times. And I've said this before in the past, I'll say it again. When these are available and the prices are reasonable, stock up on primers when you can. It's typically one of the first things become non-existent during times like now during these C19 times. So stock up on these when you can. So with that being said, if you're new to the game, they have small pistol primers and large pistol primers. You also have large pickup and drop tubes, also small pickup and drop tubes. And then obviously you're going to need some type of primer flip tray. So let's go over a few notes here before we dive into die setup and actually do some reloading. Now, number one, first and foremost and most important, is to make sure that you have your safety glasses. I've seen too many instances, pictures on Facebook of primer tubes exploding, and obviously you're dealing with powder, so I can't stress this enough. Number two is to make sure that your equipment is clean, especially if you're using a progressive press. If you want this process to be smooth with no hiccups, definitely make sure that your entire press is clean, all that your dies are clean. And if I was to give you two suggestions to make sure they're absolutely clean, is number one, your powder drop assembly, inside and out, is completely clean. I always recommend to clean my dies and my powder drop assembly, especially the inside of the powder drop assembly, with dry lube. I like to use this Hornady One Shot dry lube, awesome product. And I will clean up all my dies, all my powder drop assemblies, like I said, especially the inside of the powder drop assembly, the rotor, everything inside the rotor. Make sure it's completely clean. You definitely don't want to use oil on the inside of your powder drop assembly. Obviously, you're dealing with powder. If you're using oil on the inside of your powder drop assembly, it's not going to be good. You're going to get clumps. You're going to get inaccurate powder drops. Trust me, make sure you're using dry lube. And then usually I will spray out the inside of my powder drop assembly and my cedar die with an air compressor, just to make sure there is no residue in there to restrict that flow of powder. Now, I'm not going to dive in really deep on how I actually set up my dies, my press. There really is no point for me to do that because obviously everyone has a different press, regardless if it's like Hornady, Lee, Dillon, Forster, Progressive, single stage. Everyone has something different. So that's where your directions are going to come into play for not only your press, but also your dies. So get out those instructions and read them. And then once you've gone through them once, read them again. Now for the new reloader, one of your questions might be is how many total reloads can I get out of my pistol brass? More times than not, in comparison to bottleneck rifle cartridges, you can get an exponential amount more of reloads out of straight wall pistol cartridges in comparison to bottleneck rifle cartridges. And the reason why that is with bottleneck rifle cartridges, especially if you full length resize and you're not neck sizing, is you're physically pushing the shoulder or the bottleneck of that rifle cartridge back during the full length resizing process, especially for something like an AR. You're bumping that back from fire form roughly 3/1000ths of an inch, and it fires. Fire forms back 3/1000ths of an inch, and you bump it back 3/1000ths of an inch. You fire it back 3/1000ths of an inch, and obviously you're shortening the life expectancy of that rifle brass. You know, something like a 223 AR for full length resizing, especially in an, like an AR, not a bolt action, you might only see 5-7 reloads, and you start to see split necks, loose primer pockets, and you're somewhat concerned about case head separation. A 308 bolt action, other than an AR, you could easily see maybe 10, 12 reloads, especially if you're neck sizing only, you might even see more. When it comes to straight walled pistol brass, you can get a lot more reloads out of that pistol brass because you're not physically bumping back a shoulder. And I'm not going to say the exact amount that you can get out of pistol brass, but 20, I've seen 30. Typically what most guys will do is they'll keep on reloading that brass until the case splits. And at that point, they obviously throw it away. It's either going to be the case splits or the primer pockets are so loose that you can't see the primer anymore, or it's an issue and you're concerned about loose primer pockets. So that's usually my rule of thumb. That's not your rule of thumb. Usually when I start seeing split cases, especially if it's my brass that I'm picking off the ground that I know I have shot, if that batch is sticking with me from the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, blah, 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 blah amount of fires on that pistol brass, when I start seeing split cases, and I know it's my brass, it's not range picked brass from other people, that's typically, I'll throw that whole batch away. Now, on the other hand, if it's a range picked brass, you don't know that this piece that you just picked up has 20 firings and this piece only has 1 firing. You just don't know. So usually if it's range picked brass, at least for me, not you, I just give her hell until that case splits and I throw it away. Now, if you own the Hornady lock and load press, you are in luck. And at least with the Hornady lock and load press, and to be honest with you, I'm sure this goes for all presses or any method of installing or seating your primers into your brass, is to make sure that your primer shuttle area is as clean as can be if you want this to go smooth as possible. Now, I have the small primer seater installed here for 9mm. I have the small primer shuttle installed for 9mm, so we're good to go there. I made sure this is all clean, and I made sure that my primer seater is clean, and that is really important to make sure that's done before your reloading process. So at least with the Hornady lock and load press, I'm going to make sure that my small pistol primer drop tube is installed. And personally, I like to put a little bit of blue painter's tape on there like that. So for those that are absolutely new, we need to pick up these small pistol primers into our pickup tube. And to get that done, at least in my setup, I like to use this primer flip tray. It's got these little abrasive ridges on here. You can put up the microphone, kind of hear it. And what this will do is we'll orientate all the primers facing one direction. You put the lid on here, you flip it over. That's obviously where it gets its name, primer flip tray. And you can see they're all facing up now. I'm gonna grab my primer pickup tube. All right, so that's 100, good to go there. Now, at least with these Hornady pickup tubes, you always get that very last one stuck on the tip. Usually what I'll do is I'll use my primer weight rod and I will just poke that thing through all the way, like that. Good to go. All right, next I need to transfer the primers from the primer pickup tube and down the primer drop tube itself. So I got my primer weight rod here. I'm going to put that at the very top of the primer pickup tube. I'm going to pull this cotter pin and that will transfer all of the primers into the drop tube. And usually I'll take a piece of 308 brass and put it on the top of the bar. Next, I'm going to run this ram and make sure that primers are flowing correctly from the drop tube into the shuttle. Now, if you're wondering why I have these in Ziploc bags, I actually will put my dies in Ziploc bags with a little chunk of cardboard here and a little bit of WD-40, and that helps to keep the rust off of my die, especially when I rarely reload progressively for pistol ammunition, unless prices warrant it. Now, in this example of the 40 Smith & Wesson 3-die set, and this is what I initially started out with when I first started to reload, was with 40 Smith & Wesson. It's kind of one of those things that you just don't know better. And this particular 3-die set obviously has the resizing die and decapping die. This die here flares out the case mouth opening so you can get that bullet in there before it's seated. And then this is a special die, if you're absolutely new, that not only seats the die but also crimps the die all in one shot. And I found this to kind of be a pain in the butt to use and to get it set up just properly. So I still use this. Obviously I purchased it and I plan on still using it, and I have it set up so I don't have to keep on screwing around with it. Especially if you go from different bullet manufacturers, it's kind of a pain in the butt to get set up. So when I purchased recently my 9mm die set, I went with this Lee Deluxe 4-die set that not only has the resizing and decapping die, the die for flaring out the case mouth opening, Obviously we got our Hornady powder drop assembly here, and this is just a die for seating. And you can see I put a little mark on here for this particular bullet that we're about to use. And I just got a mark on there because I already have this set for that specific coal of 1.12, I believe. And then there is a separate die here for crimping, and they're not all in one die, and I actually prefer that rather than this type of die that does it in one shot, because these are kind of a pain in the butt to set up, especially if you go from a round nose to a flat point. You got to completely screw around with this, and I actually prefer having these separate, the seater and the crimp, in two different dies. It just makes it easier in my opinion. Now, with that being said, if you are going to town and you're reloading thousands of rounds and you're not particularly paying attention to the powder being dropped inside that case, as that stage comes up and drops powder out of your powder drop assembly into the case, and you can physically inspect it. Sometimes it's hard to do that if you're reloading mass quantities. And that's where something like this, which is an RCBS powder cop lockout die. This is a special die that will check the level of the powder in the dropped case to make sure that there is powder in the case before the bullet is seated. And what this particular die will do is, if it doesn't recognize any powder in the case, if it's too much or it's too little or none at all, this will recognize that and will shut down the entire progressive assembly in regards to not getting a squib load. That's one of the worst things you got to consider when you're reloading pistol ammunition progressively, is putting either too much powder in there over your projected powder drop, or little to no powder at all, which is really bad. If you don't drop any powder in that casing and all there is a primer, and you pull the trigger on that pistol, what's going to happen is that bullet is going to get stuck into the barrel. It's not going to exit the muzzle, especially if you're pulling that trigger really quick, and that next round goes in and you're going to get what's called a squib load. There's a potential for your barrel to blow up. So that's where this is really important. If you're not physically inspecting every individual casing as it's going through the progressive nature of your press. And you're going to watch that here in a little bit, but I just want to make note that obviously I can't use this because all of my stations are filled up. Obviously I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and all presses are different. Some have less, some have more. And obviously if I'm using all these dies, I can't particularly use this. So, you know, obviously I can use this if I'm using a 3 die set, and I probably would do that. But being that I'm using a 4 die set, this lockout die is a no-go. And I need to make sure I physically inspect every single case as it goes through the progressive nature of this press to make sure there is at least powder in there, and it's not too much or not too little, and all the levels are consistent. So I highly recommend using some type of lockout die when possible. If you have an open station for it, use it. Even if you're inspecting every individual case, I highly recommend using this, but obviously I can't do this with a 4 die set. So this is a no-go, like I said. But if you have the station for it, use it. And there's numerous other lockout dies other than this RCBS lockout die. Some are electronic, some have beepers, some are manual like this one. But in short, if you can use it, use it. Otherwise, you need to pay close attention to that powder being dropped physically in the case. I can't stress that enough, and how important it is. So once again, all presses are different. Read those directions. But for this pure example here, with the Hornady lock and load press, with the Hornady powder drop assembly here, I have the correct rotor in here for doing pistol. This something is a larger rotor here. This would be something for more like a large rifle cartridge. And obviously make sure you're using the correct parts. So read those directions, and once you get done read them again. Now, at least for me and this Lee Deluxe 4 die set, I took the lock rings off of that die set. I found them to be terrible. I actually ended up putting on some Hornady lock rings, which were much better in my opinion. And obviously this is a Hornady lock and load that uses these bushings. It's got a little bit of a rubber washer underneath the bushing. It gives it a little bit of a free float nature that allows us to wobble just a little bit. But other than that, let's get this going on the die overview. Now in stage 1 here, I have my sizing and decapping die. For those that are absolutely new, you'll see there's a decapping pin. This physically pushes out the spent primer before we seat the new primer here. And obviously that's important. We need to get that old primer out and the new primer in. And also this die puts the body of the brass back into spec. So this is one of the very first steps in the reloading process. Now, because of this pin, there is a hole on the top of my ram. For those that are absolutely new to the game, you can see there's a hole here that allows that spent primer to go down the tube and into the bucket below. Now, at least for me, what I like to do is I like to make sure there's a clear side to my bucket. So when that spent primer is pushed out of that brass, goes down that tube, I can physically hear that primer hit the bucket. And that's something I would suggest doing, making sure you either have a clear bucket or one side of it clear so you can physically hear that spent primer getting expelled. Now, if you're absolutely new to the game, it's really important to make sure that you're running your press ram with full stroke motions all the way down. Give a little force at the bottom, and especially at the top of the stroke, you're pushing forward to seat that primer all the way into the primer pocket. If you short stroke it at the bottom, what can happen, for pure example, is you might not drop enough powder, and especially at the top of the stroke when you're pushing forward, you're not pushing forward with enough force, you might not seat that primer all the way into the primer pocket. And the name of the game when seating that primer in the primer pocket is you want that primer to seat just below flush. And if it is marginally sticking out ever so slightly out of that primer pocket, you can get what's called a slam fire, and that is not good. So make sure at the top of that stroke, you're pushing forward with an ample amount of force to make sure that primer seats correctly. So like I said at the beginning of this video, I can't show you all of these processes in one video. The good old YT won't let me do that, but I can at least show you here with decapping and belling out the case mouth opening. And then in part 2, we're going to go over the powder drop, seating the bullet, and the crimp, and some other miscellaneous notes at the end. Using this Lee Deluxe pistol die set, instructions is a narrative of about what we're going to do here. The first step here is number 1, prepare your cases. Discard cases with defects such as split necks, indications of head separation, or anything that would make them unusable for reloading. And as you're pulling that brass out of your bag here, you want to quickly inspect it for any splits, anything that would tell you that it's unsuitable for reloading. Next is the full-length resizer, which resizes the brass and gets the brass back into spec and pops out that primer. And that's what we have in the first station here. So I'm going to grab one of my pieces of brass here, and I am going to raise the ram. You hear that spent primer into the bucket, and I'm going to lower the ram and push it home with force, seating that primer, which you can see right here. And the name of the game here for that seated primer is you want it to seat just below flush. You don't want it sticking out whatsoever, and that can cause a slam fire. And you can actually test your brass by putting it on the table and doing what's called the tabletop test. If you slap down that brass on your bench and it wobbles at all, that means your primer is sticking out and is not just below flush. So when you first start out, you might want to do a tabletop test to make sure that your primers are seating just below flush. Next is the expander die that bells out the case mouth opening so you can actually physically get the bullet in the brass before it's seated. And it's really important to make sure that this is done just right. You don't want it too much, but you don't want too little. And this is actually a special die that you can put a funnel in and drop powder manually if you want. Obviously, I don't need to do that because in this Hornady lock and load press, it comes with a powder drop assembly here. But just read your directions. It's pretty simple. Just make sure that you have an ample amount of bell on the case mouth opening. Too little will shave copper off of your bullet when you go to seat it, or too much can result in splitting the case itself. So on the next part, I'm going to raise the ram, which is going to bell this out. On the second part, after this piece has been primed, and I'm actually going to grab another piece here and show you the difference between these two. You can physically see the one on the right has been belled out a little bit more than the one that hasn't. And obviously you need to do that so you can physically get the bullet in the case. And you don't want too much, but you don't want too little. And this is just about right. You can see there's not a huge gap around it, but there is enough of a bell that I can physically get the bullet in there and it will stick. Matter of fact, I can tip it upside down and it won't fall out. That's usually a good rule of thumb. But you don't want to bell this out too much where it splits the neck and reduce the life expectancy of that brass itself. So this is something, especially if you're new, you're just gonna have to play around with it. But once you get a method to your madness, it's not that difficult. So being that the good old YT will not let me show you the final 3 parts of this finished cartridge, I'm gonna have to end part 1 right here with decapping and belling out the case mouth opening after the primer was seated. And in part 2, we are gonna go over dropping the powder, seating, crimping, and other things such as using a case gauge and doing the barrel plunk test. So click right here and that will take you immediately to part 2 of this series.